Turns out my dad made it through all those crazy tornadoes we had yesterday. So in celebration of his life, I'd like to tell a little story. So my dad's actually a pretty interesting guy. He's a peaceful man who had to fight most of his life. He works really hard, but he used to party pretty hard too. He's really smart, but we didn't find out until late in his life that he's also dyslexic, and that's why he struggled through school. Not to mention, he was an only child in rural Kentucky and had to defend himself against bigger families all the time. That has a way of messing up your attention at school. He grew up dirt poor in a dry county. His family made ends meet by moonshining. When he got a little older, he had to leave Kentucky. The moonshining collapsed, people started dying. Well, he didn't want to be the next victim, and he didn't want to get blamed. That's why I'm a Hoosier. Anyway, Dad was a trucker in the 70s when it was cool. We used to watch Smokey and the Bandit all the time. He was also a biker. Big, burly dude with broad shoulders and a huge beard. Always wore black leather jackets and boots. Sometimes he'd ride with the Angels or the Outlaws or whoever would let him join for a little while. Anyway, between driving truck and riding his bike, up until I was around, he was away from home most of the time. He was never really part of a church, so to speak, but as he'd drive around, he'd see a camp meeting or a tent revival or something, and he'd be interested. He'd stop in and sit in the back row. Anyway, between driving truck and riding his bike, he was never really home much, up until I was born, and he was never really part of a church either. So as he'd drive around, he'd see a tent revival or a camp meeting service, and he'd stop in and join. And he'd always sit in the back row because he knew he didn't fit in. He didn't really want to talk to the people anyway. He just needed to be somewhere. With those tent revivals, it's pretty common to preach against a whole litany of sins, whatever people are upset about at the time. And one thing Dad heard a lot was that it's a sin for men to wear rings. One day he got fed up with it and spouted off, "I don't take my rings off for no man." But clearly he wasn't too certain about that, because the question kept bugging him, and every now and then he'd run into a preacher who he respected enough that he'd ask about it. Is it a sin for men to wear rings? And he said every answer he got was stupid. Anyway, one day Dad was unloading the back of his truck, and he jumped off, and one of the rings on his hand caught, and it stayed with the truck. Dad wore a lot of rings, and some of them he made himself. And this one ring didn't fit really well, so he cut it so it would expand. And that happened to be the ring that caught when he jumped off. Anyway, he hit the ground, and he looked expecting to be missing a finger. But no, they were all there. The one was pretty swollen and bloody, and there was the ring hanging on the back of the truck. Anyway, he was back on the road again, stopped in at another tent revival, and he said this preacher was kind of special. This was a guy who had a good head on his shoulders, who wouldn't give you a lot of BS. So he said this was the guy he really wanted to ask. So when the meeting was over, he went up to the preacher and said, "Listen, I've asked a lot of people this question, but I really need to know, is it a sin for men to wear rings?" The preacher thought for a second and said, I can't tell you that. But here's what you should do. Go home tonight, take off your rings, set them on the table beside your bed, and don't put them on the next day. When you get home that night, try them back on, see how you feel. Dad said he went home and took off his rings and put them all on his bedside table there, and a week later, he realized he forgot to try them back on. So he sat down, and he picked up that split ring first and slid it on his finger. And sure enough, he felt really, really uncomfortable. After a little contemplation, he realized he's not allowed to wear his rings anymore. Not because it's a sin, but because he needs reminded who he is. To this day, he still says it's a sin for him to wear any jewelry, and I've never seen him wear any, not even his wedding ring. Because for him, it's a reminder of being permanently marked by an encounter with God. In my dad's words, that was the day he met the man he would take his rings off for. So I've taken that practice on myself. Not because I have to, but I'm kind of an heir to a tradition. I've inherited this conviction that right and wrong aren't these abstract ideas that we have control over. Right and wrong are rooted in encounter with the living God. Being right is just jiving with the God who is real. And being wrong is jiving with a God of your own creation. I like that. It's that kind of earthy and profound approach to faith that I had to rediscover when everything was stripped away and I couldn't believe anymore. Even if the people in the churches were squabbling over and scrambling to defend a petty and insecure God, my dad told me about a God who was worth believing in. That's the God I decided I want to meet. Is there anything like this in your life, where it's not really wrong for most people, but for some reason you know you can't do it? I find these kind of stories fascinating, and I'd love to hear yours. Leave it in the comment section below. Thanks for liking, sharing, and subscribing.